ערב טוב וברוכים הבאים. אנחנו שמחים לארח היום כאן בקמפוס אוניברסיטת תל אביב את האירוע החשוב והמשמעותי במיוחד בעת הזו תחת הכותרת ההשפעה הכלכלית של המהפכה המשפטית. הערב הוא פרי שיתוף פעולה של מכון פרנקל צוקרמן לכלכלה גלובלית, המכון הישראלי לדמוקרטיה, מכון אהרון למדיניות כלכלית באוניברסיטת רייכמן והמועדון העסקי באגודת ידידים של אוניברסיטת תל אביב. האירוע משודר בשידור ישיר לצופים בארץ ובעולם. Good evening to our viewers around the globe. אני מתכבד להזמין לבמה את פרופסור יעקב פרנקל, ראש מכון פרנקל צוקרמן לכלכלה גלובלית באוניברסיטת תל אביב, חתן פרס ישראל ולשעבר נגיד בנק ישראל. Please welcome Professor Jacob Frankel. Yeah, let's give him a round of applause.
תודה רבה לך, אמנון, נשיא אגודת הידידים והמועדון העסקי של אוניברסיטת תל אביב. Ladies and gentlemen, since our efforts and aim is to hear from and learn from experience of our colleagues abroad, the entire event will be in English. And our colleagues from abroad will be speaking to us, and some of them are already here with us here. This is an event that is bringing together three institutes, and we will all sit somewhere as flower pots at the table there. We will only listen. We have a screen in front of us, so we will know what you are doing. But these are very serious days. In fact, probably the most serious days that we have had since the creation of our state. And I'm not talking about military challenges. I'm talking about the character and nature of our country, of our society, and of all of us. So that's why it's so important that we listen carefully to the stories and experiences of those who were there before. And we have on our program, as you have seen, so I will not repeat it, we have governors of central banks, we have ministers of finance, we have Nobel laureates, we have distinguished professors, we have industrial leaders, and we will therefore be not giving lectures of half an hour or so. Each one will have very limited time. Make your point, get out, and let the next one come in. And you will see at the end of it that while everyone comes from different parts of the world with different experiences, there is some theme. And we need to identify the theme and ask, what do we do with it? I think that we will be lucky and fortunate if the lessons that have been acquired from other experiences will be learned by us, so we will save a lot of time and energy. Let me immediately introduce my colleagues, and it is a joint effort of three institutes and three universities and three institutions. First, we have with us, and when I finish to introduce you, you please join the stage. We have with us Professor Karnit Flug, who is a Vice President of Research and the William Davidson Senior Fellow for Economic Policy at the Israeli Democracy Institute, and a professor of economics at the Department of Economics in the Hebrew University, and of course, a former governor of the Bank of Israel. We also have with us the third pillar of our three-pillar organization, Professor Tzvi Eckstein, who is the Dean of the Tiomkin School of Economics, head of the Aaron Institute for Economic Policy at the Reichman University, and a former Deputy Governor of the Bank of Israel. Tzvika, please. Just to prepare you to what's going to happen, we are going to have some remarks made from this podium. We are going to have some remarks made through the screens. And we are going to have some clips that will be relevant to set the tone of what we are doing. And let me start with a brief video. When I say brief, you will see that we are measuring it in seconds, of 2 clips. And after this, after the clips, Professor Karnit Fluk will come to introduce the first speaker. And the 2 clips are by 2 heads of state that addressed, in one way or another, the issues that we face today. The first head of state, of course, is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the Prime Minister of Israel and has been for quite a few years. And the second is a clip from President Joe Biden, the President of the United States. After these clips, we will move immediately to the other parts of the program. Okay, the clips, please.
אני מאמין שמערכת משפט חזקה ועצמאית היא זו שמאפשרת את קיומם של כל המוסדות האחרים בדמוקרטיה. אבל אני מבקש שתראו לי רודנות אחת, חברה לא דמוקרטית אחת, שבה קיימת מערכת משפט חזקה ועצמאית. אין דבר כזה. בכל מקום שבו אין מערכת משפט חזקה ועצמאית, הזכויות אינן יכולות להיות מוגנות. למעשה ההבדל בין המדינות שבהן יש זכויות על הנייר ובין מדינות שבהן יש זכויות בפועל, ההבדל הזה הוא מערכת משפט חזקה ועצמאית. וזוהי הסיבה שאני עושה ואמשיך לעשות כל שביכולתי כדי לשמור על מערכת משפט חזקה ועצמאית. רק בחודשים האחרונים גנזתי כל חוק שאיים לפגוע בעצמאות המערכת, מהניסיון לקיים שימועים לשופטים בכנסת, דרך הגבלת עתירות בבית המשפט, ועד לשינוי הרכב הוועדה לבחירת שופטים. אני אמשיך לפעול כך. בכל פעם שיגיע לשולחני חוק שעלול לפגוע בעצמאות בתי המשפט בישראל, אנחנו נוריד אותו.
The genius of American democracy and Israeli democracy is that they are both built on strong institutions, on checks and balances, on an independent judiciary. Building consensus for fundamental changes is really important to ensure that the people buy into them so they can be sustained.
Thank you very much. And we will now ask Professor Karnit Fluk to introduce our first speaker and the logic of why she is the first speaker. Thank you.
Okay, so good evening. And I want to introduce Professor Suzy Navot, who serves as a vice president for research at the Israeli Democracy Institute and is a full professor of constitutional law. Before her appointment to the IDI, she was a faculty member at the Faculty of Law in Rishon LeZion. And for over 10 years, she served as a visiting professor at the National Security College and visiting professor at the Sorbonne. Her areas of research include constitutional law, law of institutions, parliamentary law, and comparative constitutional law. In the last few weeks, Professor Navot has been working intensively on the judicial so-called reform. So before we actually get into discussion of the economic consequences of the judicial overhaul or revolution, it is important that we hear what are the main elements of the legislation and what all of them together mean for our democracy. Thus, I think there is no better person to provide us with a very short overview of the planned reform than Suzy Navot. So Suzy Navot couldn't be here with us, but we have a clip where she will explain what are the pillars of the judicial so-called reform.
Hello and welcome. I am Suzy Navot, Vice President of IDI, and I would like to welcome you all to this conference on the economic impact of the so-called judicial reforms. I'm sorry that I cannot be with you now. Still, I would like to give you a very brief overview of Israel's system and of this reform. First of all, let me tell you that Israel has no single document known as the Constitution, but it has several basic laws that, although they have been granted constitutional status by the Supreme Court, they are very easy to enact and may be easily amended. Although it is not a real constitution, until today, it has served to limit the power of the government. Now, if a regular law infringes upon rights protected in one of these basic laws, the Supreme Court of Israel may strike down the law and declare it unconstitutional. This fragile constitutional structure exposes Israel to the dangers of democratic erosion much more than in any other democratic country. In every country, there are mechanisms, there are tools that decentralize political power. There are checks and balances. For example, a rigid constitution that protects human rights, or a bicameral legislative system. Sometimes the president has a right of veto or a federal structure, and sometimes also the existence of international organizations and courts, such as the European Court of Human Rights. All of these are tools that are part of the idea of the checks and balances. But none of these exist in Israel. Israel is unique. Israel is the only country among the countries that have been defined as free by the Freedom House, the only country that does not have any tool for the decentralization of political power. Our parliament has 120 members, and 61 votes are all you need to change Israel's basic laws. 61 is all you need to change the system of government, to change the power of the courts, or even to become a non-democratic state, to limit or to abolish any human right. In Israel, and only in Israel, 61 is absolute power. And the Supreme Court is actually the only branch that may limit this absolute power. And therefore, today, the Supreme Court and its independence are under attack. Now, about the reform. This judicial reform includes 5 main issues. 1, an override clause that will allow a simple majority in the Knesset to override a court's ruling on unconstitutional legislation. 2, that the Supreme Court will not be able to deal with amendments to the basic laws. 3, that the court will no longer be able to use the standard of reasonableness to review government decisions. 4, the legal advisors to government ministries will be appointed by the minister. And 5, politicians will appoint all the judges. Now, what do all these proposals have in common? First, that the government wants absolute and unlimited power, because an override clause and the provision that the Supreme Court cannot strike down a basic law will eliminate all restrictions on legislation. Again, it is important to understand that in Israel, the legislative branch is controlled de facto by the government. A coalition majority controls the parliament. Now, the second thing these proposals have in common is that almost every institution that is currently professional, neutral, objective, and independent will be politicized. Judges will be chosen by politicians. which means actually political control of the courts, and legal advisors of the government ministers will be appointed by the ministers. And if this is not enough, take a look at the process through which these reforms are being passed. We are witnessing a critical legislative process and Knesset committees' deliberations of a sort never seen before here. Hasty, even brutal, sometimes humiliating, with an ongoing contempt and disrespect towards civil servants and professionals, to the point that it seems that the race to the finish line, meaning the rapid passage of this reform, justifies all means. These are indeed difficult times for Israel's democracy, for its society, and yes, possibly also for its economy. However, this is your field of expertise, and I will leave it to the experts. Thank you for coming, and I wish you a fruitful conference.
Thank you very much, Professor Susie Navot. To the extent that any one of you was indifferent before Susie Navot spoke, I'm sure that you are less indifferent now. But I think that we received a checklist, and that's the most important element. And checklist is that even those of us who are not experts in the legal area, whenever proposals will come up for a compromise or for solutions or whatever, we have the checklist against which to judge and assess, do we overcome the challenges that Professor Navot has pointed out. Before I invite Professor Tzvika Eckstein to introduce our next speaker, let me just mention with sorrow that Professor Ariel Porat, who was supposed to open the meetings, the president of Tel Aviv University, is unable to be with us because his father passed away, and we are sending him our condolences. So I will move now directly to Professor Tzvika Eckstein. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for coming, and I'm glad and honored to introduce Professor Jean Tirole. Professor Tirole is honorary chairman of the Foundation of Jean-Jacques Lafont Toulouse School of Economics and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. He is laureate of the 2014 Nobel Prize in Economic Science for his analysis of market power and regulation, which had a huge impact on policies today throughout the world. The prize's scientific background includes the most important contribution related to our conference tonight: The Politician and the Judge, Accountability in Government, published in AER 2004 with Nobel laureate Eric Meskin. Professor Tirole has published more than 200 papers that cover industrial organization, regulation, finance, macroeconomics, and banking, and psychological-based economics. While each market is unique, which is his main contribution, and the uniqueness is important, Tirole unveiled general rules in the design of optimal regulation, the independence of the judiciary system. Thank you for coming with us. Please, Jean Tirole.
Well, thank you, Sui. I would like to say I'm delighted to be with you tonight, but I'm not. As Jacob said, those are very serious times for Israel and the world. The proposed reform of the institutions which are going to prevent the Supreme Court from striking down laws and facilitate the appointment of judges by politicians is a source of utmost concern on the one hand for its citizens, and for the populations whose fate hinges on the existence of a rule of law, and on the other hand, for its economy. Let me start with the former, the checks and balances case. There are 4 good reasons why an independent judiciary is better suited to serve the interests of citizens. The first is kind of obvious. Elected officials cannot be church and party. As we all know, unscrupulous officials may engage in corruption, privacy violations, election rigging, and fiscal or regulatory harassment of opposition politicians and intellectuals. And only independent churches can put a lid on such behaviors. The second reason goes back to the tyranny of the majority that was highlighted by the writers of the Federalist Papers in 18th century America or the 19th century philosophers in England, John Stuart Mill in his book on liberty. They pointed out that majorities are prone to oppress minorities, whether ethnic, religious, linguistic, political, or sexual. And of course, Israel has many of those. Democratic constitution, I fully realize that Israel is an exception, doesn't really have a constitution, a proper constitution, but those constitutions are there to guarantee equal rights for the minorities. And there cannot be a real democracy without an independent judiciary forcing governments to abide by the constitutions. Third reason, politicians tend to focus on the short term due to their re-election concerns. Now, nothing wrong with that, of course, because that's what democracy is about. They are about elections. But an elected official, in contrast, can take a more foresighted perspective. And that has been the rationale for the creation of independent agencies such as central banks. We have a number of central bankers today. And the idea there was to limit the politician proclivities for open bar, for the election business cycle, for example. And also we wanted to strengthen banking regulation. I could say the same thing for competition authorities, which started becoming effective once they were taken out of the hands of politicians. Now, in the realm of politics, policy moves that are highly divisive may generate short-term political gains, but at the expense of long-term cohesiveness. And the fourth reason, the reason that hasn't happened yet, but is a slippery slope. Now, it's always true that governments which have illiberal inclinations try to encroach on the judiciary's counterbalancing power. But recently there have been a number of concerns about the future of our liberal democracies. There is a general trend, it's not specific to Israel. We have seen legally elected populist governments in Russia, in Poland, in Hungary, in Turkey, which have consolidated their power over time by reducing the court's autonomy and appointing ideologues on their bench. Such moves usually go together with the capture and control of the media and the designation of enemies of the people, the foreigners, the domestic minorities, the experts. And obviously Israel should not be following on the tracks of those countries. Now, something you have to realize is that the independence of the judiciary will be even more important tomorrow. New technologies such as AI or facial recognition allows the state to achieve social control at almost no cost. The marginal cost has gone down to zero. States can use social rating systems like the one designed in China to target political opponents and sympathizers of non-aligned organizations and transform them into social pariahs or the object of violent repression. And make no mistake, the last bulwark against societal control will be the Supreme Court. Any attempt at polarizing the latter or reducing its power is a threat to the country and a threat to the world more broadly. Finally, let me come to the economic issues. I would like to stress that even if there were no economic damage, the case would be clear-cut, but there are at least 4 channels through which the Israeli economy could suffer from the legal reform. The first has to do with foreign economic relationships, and have in mind here foreign direct investment, for example, socially responsible companies, venture capitalists, sovereign funds will stay away from a country that doesn't abide by the rule of law and doesn't protect its minorities. Countries such as Europe, too, may more and more condition imports and exports on their abidance by the rule of law as they start doing so with labor and environmental issues. I have in mind here in particular sustainability compacts. Second channel, the labor market. Israel, as you know better than I do, relies much for its defense, but also for its export. Over 54% of its export come from the tech industry. And I kind of doubt that the rather liberal tech elites will flock to a country with a rather reactionary bent on policy regarding various societal issues. Third economic issue, has to do with unruliness. A healthy economy also relies on a stable political situation. The reform is likely to exacerbate already very high tensions between Jewish Israelis and between them and Arab Israelis and Palestinians. And therefore it may make Israel a rather unattractive place to invest in economic activity despite the huge human capital there is there. And finally, another slippery slope. Down the road, after the consolidation of power in a few hands, through the reform, further reforms might be contemplated. It's pretty hard to foresee what they are, but let me try. It could be the weakening of property rights. They usually are protected by a court system, or at least the property rights of a few categories of people. Macroeconomic populism, the revisiting of the central bank and other independent agencies' autonomy, and all of those will damage the economy. Today's Israel is a much divided society, and it's all the more reason to act wisely and safeguard the democratic institution. Well, thank you very much. I probably have taken too long, but thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Jean. Very wise remarks. Our next speaker is Professor Kenneth Rogoff, who is the Thomas D. Cabot Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He is the former Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund, a man with great experience. There is something unique about Ken, which when you think about it and go home and reflect on it, you will ask, what are the qualities that make a scientist and a researcher so deep and so successful? And then you go to Ken Rogoff's biography and you see where he started. Ken is a grandmaster in chess. He won the US Junior Championships in chess. When he grew up, he took the second place in the US Championship. He's one of the few that received unreserved compliments from Bobby Fischer, who played with him. And with this, he came to economics. And when he came to economics, he acquired an extraordinary academic career, MIT, Princeton, Harvard, the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, where he served as the chief economist. He's one of the few, and maybe almost the only one, who wrote an extraordinary book for seeing in advance the trouble and the crisis that besieged Europe the 2008 crisis, where everyone who needs to study the role of debt and what does it do to society looks at this book that he did together with Carmen Reinhardt. Frankly, we have a lot of Nobel laureates in our program, but in my book, this researcher is a Nobel Prize recipient, needs to be. His book is a classic, but in a different way than others. As you know, a definition of a classic is a book that everyone quotes but nobody reads. His books, everyone quotes and everyone reads. So, Ken, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, Jacob, thank you very much for those kind words and greetings to the audience in Israel and around the world. It saddens me to be speaking at this in the sense that I can't believe this is happening in Israel. I understand that after so many close elections and so many heated debates, there's a desire to sort of cut the Gordian knot and find a durable solution. This is not it. The problem of how to make major changes in a country, whether economic or otherwise, goes back to the earliest days of democracy. The Greeks thought about this problem a lot. And the general solution, and we heard from the earlier speakers, the general solution that other countries have adopted is to require a supermajority or checks and balances when you want to make a big change. We can point to what happened in the UK with Brexit, where it was done with a simple majority. That was no way to make a decision like a divorce from the European Union. And I can't say how it's going to turn out in the long run. It's certainly difficult now for the British economy, but it's just not a way to make durable, lasting changes. So let me just pick a few, important economic point. This has been made by Professor Frankel and Professor Tirole really just brought this up, but I can't stress it enough. A fundamental role of a court system in most democracies is to protect the rights of minorities. There is no economic minority that needs its rights protected more than foreign investors. Foreign investors are loath to go into most countries in the way that they have gone into Israel. Foreign investment, and I would say more broadly, integration with foreign firms. So it's not just money, it's combining knowledge, combining expertise, joint ventures, have been absolutely central to the blossoming of the tech sector in Israel, which not only has driven exports, as Jean Tirole cited, has obviously had huge knock-on effects to the whole economy, but of course is absolutely central to Israel's national security. Part of the reason why we have confidence in Israel going forward is that it really is a leader in tech and far above not only its neighbors, but those who might want to help its neighbors. And doing something to undermine the tech sector, it might not happen right away, but there's so many reasons this is going to. I really think the long-term effects would be really significant. It's not just foreign investors, it's domestic investors, property holders. We tend to think of them as very privileged. Nobody particularly wants to help the well-off who hold buildings or hold big companies. And yet, if you want to have a dynamic system, you can tax them That's fine, that's transparent. But you need a system that protects ownership and protects their rights. And we can go across so many other issues here. Now, I think, as Professor Tyrol said, this is going on all over the world. It's not just in places like Hungary, Poland, Russia. We've certainly had issues with this in the United States. There are people looking at former President Trump denying that he lost the election and trying hard to change the system to say he didn't. It almost seems like it couldn't have happened in the United States. It did. But also the progressives who are very powerful in the current government have made proposals which in many ways are similar to what we're hearing now from Israel, ideas of stacking the Supreme Court, not undermining it, but just adding their friends or people they think will give the right opinion in order to overrule the court. And you know, it's a terrible idea for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that when the other party gets in power, they will add more people. There's less talk about doing that at the Federal Reserve, but there has been talk about that. And I think this has been made by others, but once you've gone after the Supreme Court, you can then go after other independent institutions, and the central bank is certainly a very important one. You want to have strong technocrats. You need these independent voices. You need these independent institutions in order to promote a healthy economy and a healthy democracy. There's much more to be said. I will leave other speakers to say it. Of course, there are issues that can be looked at, how to strengthen Israel's system. I certainly wouldn't say constitutional changes or changes that are dramatic like this. There's no constitution. I wouldn't say they should be off the table, but you need a process just to get a tiny majority. There is a legitimately elected government, but a tiny majority, and then suddenly make sweeping changes with permanent effects is no way to run a country. And investors are certainly not going to like it. And again, it's not just the foreigners that will suffer. All investors and entrepreneurs in Israel, which have helped the economy tremendously, are going to be scared by this as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken, and reminding us that the issue is not just the crisis countries. We have also, you brought the US example. Really appreciate your insights. Our next speaker is Professor Leszek Balcerowicz. Professor Leszek Balcerowicz is from the Warsaw School of Economics today. His claim to fame is that he has been the first Minister of Finance during the Mazowiecki's government, the first non-communist government in Poland. Leszek Balcerowicz is the architect of what is called the Balcerowicz Plan, the plan that brought Poland to the modern world. He was the preacher and implementer of free market economic reform. Over the years, he was Deputy Prime Minister of Poland twice. He was President of the National Bank of Poland, which is central bank governor for quite a few years during the first decade of 2001 through 2007. But most importantly are his qualities. They are known in the world as the man who has 4 C's. And the C's are credibility, commitment, consistency, and courage. And it's not simple to be courageous during the years in which he initiated the Balcerovich plan, stood at the beginning almost alone against everyone, and at the end of the day, winning the day because he was right. So please, Leszek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you very much for inviting me. As you might remember, Poland moved in a decisive way at the turn of 1989 and 1990 towards market economy, democracy, and the rule of law. And we persisted on this way with rather good results until 2015, when there was a change in power, to which I will come in a minute. But let me say that after 1989, we created two very important institutions dealing with the rule of law. The first was National Council of Judiciary, a politically independent institution which selected the candidates for judges in ordinary courts. And the second, Constitutional Tribunal, consisting of constitutional lawyers, which assesses the agreement or disagreement between legislation and our Polish constitution, which has been fully developed and enacted in 1997. We have a change in the government at the turn of 2015 and 2016. This government has a nationalistic status orientation, which might resemble something in Israel. And for the first time in our history after 1989, the pillars of the rule of law, the institutional pillars, have been under attack. First, they captured de facto the National Council of Judiciary by adding 15 new members, which are politically controlled. And as a result, they nominated 3,000 new judges. The second, Constitutional Tribunal, was also captured by inserting or adding new members, which are compliant with the policies of the present government. So in fact, the pillars, the institutional pillars of the rule of law created in Poland after 1999 has been politically captured. Now, the rating agencies have initially reacted to these moves by lowering ratings of Poland's economy, but they reverse it. What's, I think, a very, very important is that Polish political opposition is united, absolutely united, in opposing these measures which are in disagreement with Poland's constitution. And I think we have elections in October, November next year, and it is likely that opposition will win these elections and would reverse the changes hostile to the rule of law and Poland's constitution. I would finish by noting that there are two important differences between Israeli situation and Poland situation. First, that we have a fully fledged and developed constitution, which makes it easier to compare, to notice what are the violations of constitution. And second, the European Union. Poland belongs to the European Union, and European Union has been very decisive in opposing the changes in Poland. So the conclusion would be that Israel, lacking these, especially the second difference, has to be even more mobilized in opposing the proposed changes. And of course, I wish you luck in this endeavor. Thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Leszek. Everyone looked so good when, for years after you introduced the stabilization in Poland, Poland was viewed as the winner, and indeed foreign investors poured into Poland, and Poland rewarded them. So much so that one almost declared victory and said, you see, we can change forever. But before you finish the sentence forever, suddenly a change in government took place and did the U-turn. And if there is one lesson in it, is never declare victory. Just be on the guard, day in and day out. Small deviation is the prelude for large deviation. And everything bad needs to be removed while it is still bad. So we are now ready to have the next speaker, and I will ask Professor Karnit Flug to come and introduce him, please.
So, our next speaker is, I want to see you, Mr. Andras Seymour, who is the former governor of the Central Bank of Hungary. He spent most of his professional life in senior executive positions in the banking industry in Budapest, London, and Vienna. Andras retired from his position as a senior vice president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and is currently a member of the supervisory board of Erste Group Bank in Vienna. We're extremely grateful to you. I can't see you, but yeah, I can. For being here in person. And we think that the Hungarian experience that you're going to briefly share with us is probably the most relevant for Israel at this moment. We hope it will serve as a warning as to what awaits us if the judicial overhaul will proceed as contemplated. What is clear from your experience is that the stifling effects on the economy are not felt at once. It is a process that slowly depresses the innovative and dynamic spirit of society. For Israel, being so dependent on our very mobile and innovative high-tech sector, the potential effects can be devastating. So, Andras, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karnit, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk about the Hungarian experience, the impact of autocratic leadership on the development of the Hungarian economy. First part, I'm going to talk about what happened in the judiciary, and the second part of my contribution is about the economic impact that we suffered. In 2010, Viktor Orbán's party won the Hungarian elections with a landslide, resulting in a supermajority in parliament. This meant unlimited parliamentary power, enabling them to unilaterally rewrite even the constitution. A year later, a new constitution was approved. But even before that, from the first day of getting into power, they started to dismantle all the checks and balances that usually form the part of the governance of a democratic society. The Constitutional Court, the supreme forum of the protection of the Constitution, and more broadly of the rule of law, was a real thorn in Orbán's side, as they could always declare laws unconstitutional and so null and void. So first, Orbán limited the power of the Constitutional Court, and then he increased its membership and filled the court which had previously had a balanced membership with people loyal to the government and to him personally. Then he got rid of the chair of the Supreme Court. The European Court of Justice 5 years later ruled that his dismissal was against European law. but by then a new Chief Justice was in place. Currently, our Chief Justice is a person who has no previous courtroom experience. He has no practical experience in the field of litigation and court administration. Judicial administration was taken out of the self-governing body of the judiciary and became centralized under the direction of one person elected by parliament. As a result, the judiciary is now open to political influence. They also lowered the retirement age of judges from 70 to 62 years. As a result, a mass exit of senior judges began. The European Court found that forcing judges into early retirement violates European laws. Government, however, achieved its objectives. Court leaders had already vacated their positions, and new senior judges were already appointed. Through similar type of measures, the government took control of a large part of our economy and most of the media. They severely constrained the authority and financial resources of local authorities. They tweaked the whole electoral system, ensuring that the opposition parties have very little chance of winning any future election. Similar measures have been implemented by the government to establish control practically over every aspect of our life, including how we remember our history, what gets researched in our academic institutions, what our children learn in school, and to a large extent what we see on film or in the theater. It's worth noting that since 2015, we live in a state of emergency. First, because of the large wave of illegal immigration, although these migrants never wanted to stay in Hungary, they were on their way to Western Europe. Then because of COVID, and finally because of the war in Ukraine. Last year, even the annual budget of the country was decided by government decree without a single discussion in parliament. Orban, a staunch anti-communist, thus adopted the Bolshevik slogan, "All power to the Soviets." As the European Parliament stated in its recent report on Hungary, the situation has deteriorated such that Hungary has become an electoral autocracy. So the question is, how have all these measures affected the performance of the Hungarian economy? According to World Bank data, at the end of 2009, Hungary had a 5% higher GDP per capita in PPP terms than the average of the countries of Central Europe and the Baltics, the so-called EU 11, 5% higher. By the end of 21, Hungary has fallen 3% behind the EU 11. Even this result needed the support of ultra-loose monetary policy and expansionary fiscal policy. The government and the central bank were stoking the engines of growth in the years when the economy was growing at or close to its potential. This lax macro policy mix has significantly contributed to a 60% devaluation of the forint compared to the US dollar in 10 years, and to the fact that by now we became the inflation champion of the EU with an inflation rate of 26.2%. Some other relevant characteristics of our development are the following: increased state ownership and influence over the economy, driven by renationalization and significant increase in regulation. Second, specialization on relatively labor-intensive, lower value-added, and highly subsidized activities. Third, high reliance on EU grants. Net EU transferred as a percentage of GNI between 2011 and 19 averaged 4% per annum, the highest among the EU 11. Fourth, opaque public procurement system. Companies close to the government, owned by 12 individuals, won close to 30% of the public procurements in 2020. A man who who used to operate a barely profitable tiny local plumbing company in the village where Orban was born, in just over 10 years became one of the 3 wealthiest persons in Hungary, with his wealth estimated around 1.2 billion euros. 36-year-old István Tiborcs, who in 2013, when he married Orban's eldest daughter, had no notable wealth, has by now become the 36th wealthiest person in the country, with wealth over 100 million euros, and that is based only on publicly available information. It's not by surprise that in 2022, Transparency International rated Hungary as the most corrupt country in the EU. The next point is relatively low level of innovation by EU standards and low percentage of innovative SMEs. Hungary is almost the only country in the Central European region that did not seem to manage to produce a unicorn. That is a startup company that has a market value of over $1 billion US. In closing, I would say that Hungary in the last 12 years has become a country where anything can happen to anybody at any time. It can be a country of unlimited opportunities if you are on the right side of government. However, if you are not, you can be subjected to new discriminative and arbitrary taxes, you can be threatened to relinquish your property, or if you are a powerful enough multinational, you can be bought out at favorable prices to avoid persecution. You can be spied upon without any reason. You might know about Pegasus software in this country. And you can be subjected to wild and vulgar persecution by the government media empire. So that was my summary of the situation in Hungary, and this is not theory. These are all facts, and this is unfortunately what happened to us. I hope you will fare better. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Andras. I cannot say that these were encouraging remarks, but I think that we really appreciate your courage and ability to tell us what is down the road if we do not listen to you. I would like to, they were asking if you are living in Hungary. Let me move on, and we are going to have another series of brief clips before we move on with the rest of the program. But before I proceed, I would like to acknowledge and recognize the presence of Mr. Yohanan Plesner with us. Yohanan is the president of the Israel Democracy Institute. Thank you very much for gracing us here. The next series of clips represent the fact that people and organizations all over the world are looking at us, some with dismay, some with disbelief, some with advice, all with warnings. So the first one will be, and they will appear in a sequence, and I will not break them, so I'll just tell you the sequence. We will have first a very brief paragraph from the OECD draft report on Israel. OECD is the organization of the industrial countries that Israel made huge efforts for decades to be admitted. To be admitted because we believed if once we get the annual report from them, we will use it as a card to bring investors. And now they come with a warning, and we know we cannot hide this card. This is Israel as it is seen and warned by the OECD. The next two clips will come from two very distinguished Nobel laureates in economic science. One is Professor Eric Maskin from Harvard University. The other one is Professor Paul Milgrom from Stanford University. Both will be touching and have made extraordinary contributions to the theory and understanding of some important features. And it will be extraordinary arrogance to say this is just theory because we know better. So I would like very much that we listen very carefully. We will conclude these clips with a statement by what I would say today is the most important economist not in office in the US. His name is Professor Larry Summers. Larry Summers is the former president of Harvard. He's now back at Harvard. He was the Minister of Finance or Secretary of the Treasury of he worked with both President Clinton and President Obama. When he speaks, people listen. Very reasoned, a very close friend of Israel, and was hesitant to really express his views in this type of a form, because while he is known as outspoken, he's very, very kind of like a parent. He really wants Israel to succeed. He needs to tell the truth, but he doesn't want to cause any harm. So we should better listen. And at the end of it, there will be a paragraph from a rating agency that we are very watching very carefully, Standard & Poor, and they have expressed warnings. I should only say that during the last 24 hours, another rating agency, Fitch, expressed similar type of warning. So let me sit down and ask the next series of clips to come up, at the end of which I will call our next colleague. Please.
Judicial independence and judicial checks and balances are vital to a strong anti-corruption and public integrity system, trust in the government and public institutions, and a business environment that attracts investment and fosters economic performance.
Hello, I'm Eric Maskin, professor at Harvard and winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and I'm worried about the proposed judicial reforms in Israel. I'm worried that they will scare off investors. Investors have to be confident that their money is not simply going to be appropriated by the government. In a country with an independent judiciary, the courts will probably stop the government from doing this. But if the government can overrule the courts, as the reforms propose, there's no check on the ability of the government to violate investors' property rights. That's bad for investment, and it's bad for Israel.
Hello, my name is Paul Milgrom, and I'm professor of economics at Stanford University and a winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2020. I'm recording this to express my concern over the proposed changes to Israeli law that limit the role of the judiciary. My colleagues and I have already written about the importance of an independent judiciary for economics, for promoting international investment in Israel's economy. But today I want to emphasize something else, namely that giving too much power to one man or one party who's not subject to judicial review can worsen the problem of corruption. We've just seen horrible evidence of how this works in Turkey, where buildings built by friends of the current regime after the 1999 earthquake standards were set failed to meet those specifications, and they collapsed in the recent earthquake. That collapse was both an indicator of the problem and a metaphor. Those concrete buildings needed better steel reinforcement to stand the stresses of an earthquake, and Israel's government today needs the steel of its governing laws to stand the stresses that tear at Israel today. Ben-Gurion and Israel's other founders got this right, and it would be a mistake to change it now.
I'm very concerned. The first reading of the judicial reform passed through the Knesset. That was very troubling legislation, not because ultimately judicial reform is important in Israel, in my view, but that particular set of judicial reforms driven through by a narrow majority in a hurry at a fragile political moment will raise profound questions for the owners and deployers of capital, both in Israel and around the world. And I think it is a matter of very substantial economic importance for the remarkable economic story that Israel has been, that we move from a phase of driven legislation to a phase of compromise and deliberation as judicial reform moves forward.
A consistent tendency to weaken key and essential institutions or the system of checks and balances is liable to increase the risk of a reduction of Israel's credit rating.
Well, there are quite a few more clips, but you got the idea. Neither of those who were talking to us have coordinated or talked to each other because they know there is a corpus of knowledge. Let me now invite Professor Tzvika Eckstein to introduce our important last local Israeli speaker, please.
I am glad and honored to introduce Shlomo Dovrat. Shlomo Dovrat has over 40 years of recognized leadership in the high-tech sector. He is the co-founder of Viola, the largest tech investment group in Israel with over $4.5 billion under management. Shlomo began his career as a high-tech entrepreneur, eventually becoming CEO and chairman, and now board member of several leading high-tech unicorn companies such as Outbrain and Iron Source, now Unity, and several others. Shlomo has been actively involved in numerous philanthropic and public initiatives of social and economic development. He was a chairman of the National Task Force for the Advancement of the Education System set by the government, served as a chairman of the Israeli Democracy Institute, and founded, and I thank you especially, the Aaron Institute for Economic Policy, and co-founded the PNIMA as an Israeli movement aimed to address the polarized in Israel society. I want just to say a few economic issues. First, we do a lot of comparing the Israeli economy to other advanced leading economies. We are ranked number 26 in democracy now in the Economist Index of Democracies that published in 2022. We are in the corruption index in the OECD way below, or if you want above, meaning at the end of the order, not as bad as Hungary today. But as an introduction to Shlomo's remark on the impact of the proposed judiciary revolution, it is important to stress this recent success of the Israeli economy in spite of ranking not so high. And it is the success in the last 5 years, from 2017 to 22. Per capita real income grew annually by 2.3%, which is almost the highest in the recent history. I mean, not taking in consideration the early years. Actually, 4.2 real growth annually, more than most advanced countries. 60% of this growth is due to the 8.2 annual growth, over annual average growth with all the aspect of the high-tech sector. 90% of the high-tech sector is financed by foreign direct investment, and the risk Tirol and all the other economists explain from the academic perspective. This sector reached 17% of GDP, 12% of the employees, higher by large from any other developed country that we compete with. During this period, Israeli GDP closed third of the gap in the last 10 years from most advanced countries, and most importantly, over the last 5 years, the poverty rate has continued to go down, although it's very, very high, and employment rate reached their highest level ever. Shlomo, are we at risk to destroy this success today?
Thank you, Tzvika, and good evening, everybody. I want to start with a very quick overview of the status of where the Israeli economy is. You've heard from Tzvika, but I want to talk about the Israeli high-tech. Israel high-tech is really, truly a miracle, and it's at the core of the Israeli economical miracle, and many people have been taking it for granted. And I want to talk about what happened really in Israel over the last 20 years, 30 years actually. The Israeli high-tech started in the 80s, when few individuals who came back to Israel from America have started development center for multinational. If a dear person who Israel owes so much to, somebody in the name of Dov Fruman, did not come back to Israel, 15% of Israel export today is by Intel. It was only because of one person coming back from the US and developing an R&D center here in Israel. In the 90s, we saw the beginning of what we call the startup nation. The start of venture capital. We actually did not have any local investors, but foreign investors started to come here. The Israeli venture industry was in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And then after 2000, Israeli startups started to grow faster. We saw multinationals starting to buy many Israeli startups and develop what we call the multinational. Actually today, 50% of the employees in Israeli high-tech are employed by centers for 400 multinational companies, more than by far any other country. Those multinationals choose Israel because of the quality of the workforce, but because of many other reasons, which just, I don't know, they call it judicial reform. I call it something else, and I will talk about what does that mean for us. But I think the most important and the real miracle really started when social, mobile, and cloud launched in 2007, created this amazing technology transformation that really changed the world, and together with globalization and low interest rate for the last 20 years, have really caused an amazing change. Israeli entrepreneurs decided they are no longer satisfied with developing startups and selling them as soon as they get to a certain revenue. They actually want to build an industry. And the biggest news about what happened in Israeli high-tech is we built an industry. In Viola, we are fortunate. We have backed now 4 companies that are either at or above $1 billion in revenues. That's something that did not exist for 20 or 30 years of the high-tech before. And this is just Viola. There are many others. There are now 85 Israeli unicorns, actually more unicorns per capita than any other country in the world, but actually in absolute term, only second to the US. And this is a country which is less than 10 million people. The Israeli entrepreneurs decided they don't want just R&D in Israel. They've built complete company. Weeks is a 5,500 employees company. Half of their people are not technologies. They are not engineers. They're salespeople, technical support, creative, designers, administration, management. Actually, the vast majority of Israeli unicorns and Israeli startups that have gone public over the last many years, over the last 2 or 3 years, are based in Israel, with management in Israel, and what they are building is no longer startup. Calling us startup nation is a mistake. We are now a scale-up nation. We've actually built an amazing industry. This industry is impacting the economy, as Tvika said. This industry is really building a miracle for Israeli society. When the COVID started, and actually everybody then realized after the first few months of shock that this is actually accelerating economical growth, I kept telling the Ministry of Finance and the Treasury that they are totally wrong and they're underestimating the amount of taxes that they will enjoy. Israel has enjoyed tremendous amount of surplus, and actually 2022 is, I think, the first year in history in many years where the Israeli government was actually in a surplus. Our debt to equity is down to 60%. All the economists here will tell you what does that mean and where does that put us compared to anything else. This is all due to one factor, the success of the Israeli high-tech. I believe that in the last 2 months, and you can see it very clearly from the percentage of the high-tech entrepreneurs that are going out to the streets, this amazing miracle is under an existential threat. And the answer, and I'm a moderate person usually, but I'm using very clear words, existential threat. Israeli high-tech is built on 4 main pillars. The first, and one which is probably the most important, is the entrepreneurs. Unlike other industries or other commerce and factors which are really not dependent on few, Israeli tech, as much as any tech industry in the world, is really dependent. Take 50 people out of Israel, half of the Israeli tech is gone. If it was not for people like Gil Shved starting Checkpoint, there wouldn't be a cyber industry in Israel. If you think about Dov Fruman not coming back here, if you think about really tens of people, tens of entrepreneurs, this is what high-tech is all about, a single entrepreneur who has the brilliance, the creativity, the guts, and the abilities, and he's building a billion-dollar company in 6-7 years. If that person leaves the country, we lose the industry. And those entrepreneurs, they're global citizens. They will be more than welcomed by any other country in the world. Silicon Valley is dying for Israeli entrepreneurs. I have here among the crowd one of the most successful venture capitalists in the US, who happens to be an Israeli, and he would tell you they would love to back him in Boston or in California, anywhere. This is the first and the most important pillar of high-tech industry. This is not built on factories, on natural resources, on government, on anything. This is all about entrepreneurship. The second is, of course, is labor and the ability of this human capital. We're talking a lot about it. We're dealing a lot with it in the Aaron Institute. But we need free-spirited, creative people who are global in their nature, who are curious, who are, when I talk to the government in the recent days and recent months and years, obviously I've spoke to both sides of the why are all those high-techs left wings or liberals? Because they're free-spirited. That is who they are. This is what it takes to be a high-tech entrepreneur. You can be right-wing. You can have very conservative approach. That has nothing to do. But we do appreciate freedom. We do appreciate our rights. And these are the people that are building the high-tech. The third pillar, which is very important, is foreign investors. Actually, in 2021, I don't remember the 22 numbers yet, we had about $30 billion of investment in high-tech. 93% came from abroad. There is no local investments in high-tech. All the money comes from abroad. The reason foreign investors are coming here, and the government would be very wrong to assume they will continue to come here just because of technology. They are coming here because there is an independent judicial system. There is a clear laws of intellectual property. There is a clear laws of taxation. There is certainty and there is stability. And they know that if there is any issue, they can always go to the court. When those things are gone, we heard the horror story. When I heard Mr. Seymour in Hungary, I thought I was watching a horror movie, and now I'm suddenly understand, wait, I'm in the movie. So that's how I felt when I heard him. But it happens very, very quickly. The high-tech industry is totally dependent on those foreign. But there is also a fourth one, which is also very important. We don't have any local market. Israeli tech is all about export. 54% of Israeli export is high-tech. If, God forbid, Israel is not anymore a welcome citizen of the world, we are losing those markets. There is no high-tech industry. If we lose the free trade status that we have with the US because we are not as democratic as they expect us to be, if we are losing that status that we have in Europe, our new friends in the Emirates and everything else, if we lose that, we don't have a market. So I think, and I'm quite confident that the people who have orchestrated this legal reforms had other motives. And I'm sure that much of that reaction is unintended consequences of something they did not think through and did not realize. But there is a context, and I want to talk about the context. We are in the midst of an economical crisis. Actually, if you hear Larry, and I've had the pleasure of talking to him quite a bit, and if you listen to him, we are actually probably in only the beginning of a serious economical crisis globally. The retreat of globalization, there is a big transition in tech, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the retreat of globalization, the rise in inflation, the broken supply chain, of course the higher interest rate, all of that are bringing the world economy into a crisis. How bad, you all have your opinion. And it's not going to be a quick V1 like everybody expects. It's going to take time. But beyond the global crisis, there is this particular threat to the tech industry globally, which has nothing to do with the judicial reform, but it is important. And when I went on TV, and I don't remember if they did broadcast, I said you couldn't pick a worse time to play with the economy. The level of investment in technology in the last quarter was the lowest since 2015, and my forecast is that we will break record for lower investments every quarter now. The world has actually stopped investing. There is actually alternative. There is, after 20 years of interest rate of less than 1%, the real interest rate, investors have a choice. They can actually have 5-6% returns without taking a risk. All of the public markets have gone down. A lot of the pension funds are worried about that. They have to shrink their level of private investment. So in general, there will be much less money available for tech investment, and Israel has to compete for a shrinking event. And then the last point I would say, we are in the midst of what I call innovation cycle change, where we've enjoyed a lot of benefit from the iPhone and the social and internet and all that. This innovation cycle, which has been phenomenal, $1.5 trillion since 2007 has been invested globally in this. It is plateauing. For a lot of reasons, I will not go. We're beginning to see a very interesting new innovation cycle, AI, which I'm sure you've all heard about or understand now that ChatGPT is out. It's an amazing potential. It could actually change the world. It could have huge impact on the world, but it's a new innovation cycle. And I can tell you, every time there is a crisis or there is a change in innovation cycle, this is what technology history shows, there is a risk. And we couldn't pick a worse time. And I think what the government doesn't understand, this is not just about the judicial reform. What we have been witnessing in the last 8 weeks since this government was established is a relentless assault on almost every institution of our country, whether it's remarks about the independence of the central bank, which is so crucial. We have here former governors, which is so crucial for a stable monetary policy. If we see attacks on the army, on the police that has to report now to politicians, if we see even the National Library is under threat for independence. When you say, there's a great saying in French, c'est le temps qui fait la musique. There is a feeling that we are now under attack and the entire institutions are under attack. That's not a country which can provide stability and certainty to foreign investors. That's not a country where amazing entrepreneurs would want to build the next unicorn or the next company. So yes, it is a huge threat and it has to be stopped. Now, with the agreement I have with Jacob, I do want to switch to Hebrew and speak to my Israeli friends. אני רוצה ברשותכם רגע להגיד כמה מילים יותר אישיות או רגשיות. הרבה מאיתנו שבאמת עובדים 30-40 שנה על התעשייה הזאת ומקדישים את חיינו לבניית חברה ישראלית הרבה יותר בריאה, יצאו מאזורי הנוחות שלנו. אני התראיינתי פעם ראשונה אחרי 18 שנה שלא התראיינתי. אתם רואים את האנשים ברחובות, אתם רואים דאגה עמוקה. אני מכיר הרבה מאוד יזמים שלא היו מוכנים לשמוע על שום פעילות ציבורית. יש פה אתם רואים את יעקב, את קרנית, אנשים שהם מתונים, אנשים שמתבטאים במתינות בדרך כלל, וגם הם לא מאלה שמחפשים את הכותרות או את עליות עולם. אנחנו מאוד מודאגים, וזו דאגה אמיתית ועמוקה, אבל אני גם חייב להיות אופטימי. לא רק בגלל שאני יזם הייטק. אני חייב להיות אופטימי כי כשאני רואה את עשרות או מאות או לא משנה כמה, שנספור אלפי אנשים שיוצאים לרחובות, ואני יכול להגיד לכם שאם יש משהו בשיחות, אין ספור שיחות שאני מנהל עם משקיעים זרים כדי להרגיע אותם, אחד הדברים שמרגיע אותם זה המחאה. אחד הדברים שמרגיע אותם זה הכנסים. אחד הדברים שמרגיע אותם זה הכנסים, ואנחנו לא מוותרים, אין לנו ארץ אחרת.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shlomo. The schedule calls now for brief summing ups, and my colleagues have delegated this privilege to me. And I will also have it in two parts. The English part, which will be very brief because the entire meeting speaks for itself, and then the Hebrew part, which really reflects more kind of a spontaneous reaction. Let me say at the outset, we, the three of us, and most people, probably all of you, we are not politicians. We are not coming from politics. We do not have aspirations for politics. We depend on decisions that are made in the political sphere, and therefore we need to learn the dictionary. How do we communicate? How do we understand? Between us, all of us, we have had many, many decades of interactions with politicians, and we thought that we know the dictionary. The past 2 months convinced me that we do not have the dictionary. We don't know how to break the impasse. We come with logical arguments, with factual facts, with hopes, with aspirations, with realities, with examples. And the feeling is that maybe we don't break the ice or the wall. So I will leave it now to say this is a challenge. And I really want to second the remark of the extraordinary remarks of Shlomo Dovrat, who I must say, if I may, I was a very close friend of your father, and I can see the genes in action. And I can tell you, each one of the champions of our high-tech industry, which you saw just one here, is somebody we are not having the luxury to take chance about. We better listen. So given that we are not a politician, so first of all, I want to second your statement that says, well, then at least be seen, stand up, and express your views until somebody does listen. And I would like to switch now to Hebrew. יש לנו, literally, this was English, טירוף מערכות. טירוף מערכות. ומה שנותר זה רק לומר, אנחנו חייבים למצוא את הדרך לעצור את הסחף. כי הסחף הוא לא סתם שהמים זזים, החוף מצטמק. הסחף הוא לתהום. אני לא רוצה להיות מזהיר על התהום וכל הדברים האלה, אבל כל יום שעובר אנחנו מתקרבים לשם. הבולמוס הזה של החקיקה, אף אחד לא יכול להבין, מי שרוצה להבין, ולכן הדבר היחידי שאני יכול לומר פה, זה קודם כל, ייצרו את החקיקה. ואני לא אחזור לפני כל משפט ואומר, ואינני פוליטיקאי. אנחנו נמצאים עכשיו כאן בכותלי האוניברסיטה, ובאוניברסיטה הכלל הוא, אם אני לא מבין, אני מנסה ללמוד יותר עד שאבין, ואם מישהו מבין אני צריך להקשיב לו. זה לא קורה. ייצרו את החקיקה, קחו אוויר, הקשיבו למומחים, הקשיבו ליועצים, כבדו את המקצוענים, מי שלא מכבד את הזולת מבזה את עצמו. יש כל כך הרבה מה להפסיד. שלמה תיאר את תעשיית ההייטק, וזה באמת היהלום שבכתר. אבל בכל פינה שאתה מסתכל במדינה הזאת, היה חול ולא היה כלום. ופתאום היה נס, והנס לא בא out of nothing, זה בא בגלל ארבעת הדברים שתיארתי את בלצרוביץ', consistency, commitment, courage, etc. יש לנו כל כך הרבה מה להפסיד, והשאלה היא, בשביל מה? למה אנחנו מסכנים את זה? זה לא הצלחנו להבין. הדברים שבאמת, בוא נגיד נתחיל מהסוף, כולם חושבים שיש לשפר את המערכת המשפטית, כולם, אז אין ויכוח, גמרנו. הנושאים שרוב האנשים יגידו שנוגעים לכל פרט ופרט, כמו עינוי הדין, כמו מספר השופטים, כמו דברים כאלה, לא נוגעים בהם ברפורמה הזאת, בכל מקרה. אז מה נותר? נותר לסכן את כל הדברים שהתחלנו מסוזי נבות והדוגמאות שבאו, והשאלה בשביל מה? כאן באוניברסיטה, בעיקר בדיסציפלינה של כלכלה וביזנס, משפט המפתח תמיד הוא ניהול סיכונים. אתה שואל מה התשואה, מה הקוסט, מה הסיכון ובהסתברות וכל הדברים האלה. ודבר אחד ברור, על חברה מהסוג שלנו אסור ללכת על כל הקופה. כי ללכת על כל הקופה זה מושג מלאס וגאס, זה לא מושג מהחיים. וזה מושג של מהמרים. יש לנו פה הון אנושי שמספיק שהוא יחליט לזוז, אז הוא הולך, הוא לא צריך ללכת לבנק, הוא רק לארוז את המזוודה וללכת ולנסוע. בינתיים, אני רוצה להגיד לכם, הייתי בשבוע שעבר בארצות הברית, בהרבה אירועים, עם הרבה מכרים וחברים, והייתה לי תחושה שאני מבקר בבית אבל. לא שאני מבקר, כל אחד בא אליי עם תנחומים, עם סימני שאלה, מה קרה לכם, מה קורה, ומה אפשר לעזור, איך זה קרה, מה קרה וכו'. התדמית הופכת להיות מציאות, וכל יום שעובר המציאות הזאת גוברת. הגדר שכולם יושבים עליה צרה מאוד. אני לא דואג מכך שכסף יברח או לא יברח, לא זאת הנקודה. הנקודה היא שהגדר שעוצרת את הכסף שהיה מגיע, את העלייה שהייתה מגיעה, את המשקיעים שהיו מגיעים, הגדר הזאת חוסמת אותם עכשיו. אנשים שהתחילו לבוא יושבים על הגדר, אבל זה מקום צר, הם לא יישארו הרבה זמן. ולכן הזמן הוא רלוונטי. היינו אור לגויים, רצינו לקבל דירוג אשראי. אני רוצה לספר לכם, זה סיפור אישי. כשאני מוניתי לנגידות פעם ראשונה, וזה היה בשנת 91, נשלחתי לארצות הברית כדי לגייס משקיעים, הם לא הבינו מה זה. אז היה לנו ארוחת בוקר גדולה במה שקראו The Power Breakfast בריג'נסי, של משפחת טיש, וכל ההון של ארצות הברית היה ליד השולחן, ונתתי נאום חוצב להבות, ובסוף אמרתי, and please come invest in Israel. והתשובה הייתה, הם היו מאוד ישרים איתי, אמרו, you must be kidding. הקומיטמנט שלנו לישראל היא אבסולוטית, ואנחנו ניתן לכם צ'ריטי. בצדקה אנחנו נהיה טובים, זה מה שאנחנו רוצים. להשקיע? מה פתאום? יש לכם אינפלציה מאוד גבוהה, יש לכם פיקוח על מטבע חוץ, אתם מדינה סוציאליסטית, לא יודעים אפילו, יש לכם, אתם in the wrong neighborhood. עברנו כברת דרך מאז, ולכן זה מביא אותי לתקווה. בסוף, מישהו צריך להבין שיש המון מה להפסיד. באמת המון מה להפסיד, ואני רק מקווה שנמצא את המילון. אז אני רוצה לומר, לא מאוחר עדיין. אני חוזר ואומר, לא מאוחר עדיין. אני שוב שואלים, למה אתה אופטימי? כי לא מאוחר. אבל בגלל, כשאני אומר לא מאוחר, כוונה לא. אתם יודעים מה ההבדל בין בוקרה ומניאנה. זה אותו דבר, רק בוקרה זה with a lesser degree of urgency. כשאומרים כל דבר בעתיד, אין לנו את המניאנה הזה, צריכים לעשות את זה היום, ואני יודע שכאן נשאלת השאלה, מה אנחנו רוצים שיקרה? כל אחד רוצה בצורה רומנטית להגיד, בוא נתעורר, נעשה פשרות, and we will live everyone happily after. אסור להתפשר על התכנים. לבוא ולהגיד, בוא נשלב ידיים ונרקוד סביב המדורה, זה לא הפתרון עדיין. אני יכול רק לומר מילה אחת, בדמוקרטיה אי אפשר שתהיה פשרה. period. ולכן כל דבר אחר קביל, אבל לא פשרות על דמוקרטיה. רבותיי, אנחנו נמצאים במקום הנכון, בזמן הנכון, עם האנשים הנכונים, ואנחנו, תאמינו לי, חלק מהאנשים שנמצאים פה הולכים מכאן בדיוק לנסות לקדם את מה שכולנו מקווים, ואנחנו נאחל להם גם הצלחה. מי שנמצא באוניברסיטה באופן כללי, ברור שהוא חייב להיות אדם אופטימי. כי אוניברסיטה זה משהו שבונה על העתיד, אחרת מה אנחנו מבזבזים את הזמן. ואם אנחנו בונים על העתיד, אז אנחנו גם אגואיסטים, רוצים שיהיה לנו עתיד טוב, רוצים שיהיה עתיד טוב, למדנו מכל כך הרבה ניסיונות, שזה מחייב את הדמוקרטיה כפי שאנחנו מבינים אותה, וכפי שלימדו אותנו. ולכן אני סוגר עם חזרה לפרופסור סוזי נבות, אני קיבלתי ממנה צ'קליסט. כל הצעה שתבוא, תבחן על סמך הקריטריונים שהיא נתנה, אם זה עובר, קביל, אם זה לא עובר, לא קביל. רבותיי, אני רוצה להודות אני רוצה להודות לשלושת המכונים, לשלושת הארגונים. יש לנו כיסא עם 3 רגליים. אתם יודעים, בכיסא של 4 רגליים הוא יציב. אתה יכול להוריד רגל אחת, עדיין אתה יכול לסדר שהיא תהיה יציבה. אבל פחות מ3 רגליים אין כיסא. אז יש לנו את הכיסא של 3 רגליים עם הרבה תקווה. תודה רבה לכולם וערב טוב.